But first, I think it's time. Sack Victoria's Premier now. Sack Daniel Andrews. The con of this man has now been exposed. Yesterday, Andrews Racing Minister Martin Pakula announced it was actually safe enough to allow 500 owners and their connections to gather at the Cox Plate Races next Saturday. And of course it's safe. Very few people have caught the virus in the open air. I've shown you the studies, and Victoria's down to 4 or even fewer new infections a day in a state of more than 6 million people. But last night Pakula realised, whoops, he'd exposed the complete fraud of Victoria's 13-week lockdown. He was allowing 500 people racing royalty to meet when his obsessive Premier was still banning more than 10 people from gathering at a funeral. And so Pakula backed down, cancelled the Cox Plate event. True, his health officials had told him it was safe, but Pakula had to do what was popular.
I was struck by the community reaction. It's true that the health advice was that it could go ahead safely, but there are other factors to consider in terms of making a decision like that, including, whether or not it's consistent with communities' expectations given the situation that the community's in.
Caught out, so brazen. This government always claimed it acted on medical advice. Here is more clear evidence it is lying. In fact, it is so clear that the Premier today didn't even pretend this ban was medical, not political.
This went through a normal process. It was deemed safe. They weren't all, literally, they weren't all sitting on top of each other or next to each other. They would have been spread out, and they would have been there in smaller numbers over the course of the day. Again, I'm not here to interpret that. But it went through the normal process, but it was the wrong decision.
Cancelled because it's unpopular, is that correct?
Yes, and it was cancelled because clearly it didn't meet the expectations of the Victorian community.
Now, what Andrews should have said, what a responsible leader would have said, was that the Cox Plate gathering should of course go ahead. And all the other pointless bans, they should also be dropped. Melburnians should be allowed to open their shops like you see in Sydney. Melburnians should be allowed to attend churches like you see in Sydney. Melburnians should be allowed to invite friends to barbecues this Saturday to watch the AFL Grand Final, which this year has been exiled to Brisbane. Instead of relaxing those bans, this government banned the Cox Plate parties because otherwise people on Twitter, the I Stand With Dan crowd, they might start asking awkward questions about all those other equally useless bans that have smashed the state. Why were Victorians told to not go outside for more than an hour a day for nearly 3 months? Why was there a curfew, a ban on travelling more than 5 kilometres from home, now 25 kilometres since Sunday? Thank you, Dan. A lot of that was also not on medical advice. For instance, Victoria's Chief Health Officer, Brett Sutton, said he'd never argued for that curfew. The police chief said the police didn't ask for it either.
The reality is I was never consulted.
Just having one?
We had never requested a curfew.
The limits on travelling from home, many epidemiologists say there's no reason for them either. So many bans made no medical sense. But rather than admit the obvious, they were political. They were popular. Andrews and his minister have banned yet one more harmless activity. It is a con. And this con is now falling apart. Also yesterday, Brett Sutton, Victoria's Chief Health Officer, was exposed as out of his depth and desperate to keep secret the emails that proved it. Now, if you believe Sutton's evidence to the inquiry into Victoria's hotel quarantine disaster, he had no oversight of how these quarantine hotels were run. He also told the inquiry he hadn't known that the government had hired private security guards there, untrained, ill-equipped, many with poor English, many with a religious objection to alcohol-based sanitiser. course, some of those guards predictably got sick and spread the virus. But Sutton, if you believe him, didn't know they were there.
You weren't even aware that private security were being used in the hotel quarantine program until after the outbreaks.
That's correct.
But on Tuesday, the inquiry solicitors announced that they'd since found emails that Sutton must now explain to the inquiry within 7 days. One showed that Sutton, way back in March 27, had thanked a health bureaucrat for sending him an email stating that private guards would indeed be used. And another from April 1 showed that senior health bureaucrats were being told that policy and oversight of people in detention, the hotel security quarantine people, that is being handled in a strict chain of command from the chief health officer down. Sutton was in charge. So, what is Brett Sutton's excuse for telling the inquiry he never knew about those security guards? Well, it's pathetic. The health department's lawyers have told the inquiry after being caught out, Sutton instructed us he had not read the detail of the email, so his evidence to the inquiry was truthful. In fact, Sutton went further. He then told the lawyers they should therefore not give the Board of Inquiry the emails that so damned him. Now, I think Brett Sutton is in a world of trouble here. I note that he did not appear at today's daily virus press conference to answer awkward questions from journalists. But let us not make him the scapegoat. Hold him accountable, yes. Scapegoat, no, because this cover-up goes much higher. Those health department lawyers actually admitted to the inquiry this week that the department itself had withheld these emails from the inquiry, claimed that they weren't critical documents for the inquiry to figure out what it was actually asking about. And not surprisingly, the inquiry solicitors strongly disagreed. And do not forget that a fish rots from the head. As early as March 27, Andrews himself, the Premier, publicly declared security in the hotels would be provided by police and private security, as well as health officials. Yet he still insists he never knew that private security had indeed been hired. And ever since, the virus did escape from those hotels via those guards. Daniel Andrews has smashed Victoria with lockdowns, brutal lockdowns, with bans that in some cases, like with this ban on the Cox Plate parties, had no real medical purpose, as we now see. And he did that without admitting what now seems obvious. The Premier, Daniel Andrews, did not trust the likes of Brett Sutton to simply do the basics, to have an eye out for the detail. The basics like you see in New South Wales, the tracing, the quarantining, the protecting of the aged. Just do that well. But Victoria's government couldn't and covered up. And now that lethal fraud is exposed. And Daniel Andrews should go.